let's talk about some clippers. The other kind. Never clip, it adds distortion, it screws up your signal. It's generally just not something you want to do. But what if I told you that one of the dirty secrets of mastering over the past 20, 30 years or so was clipping? To get those extra couple decibels, those extra few loudness units just squeezed out of the top, there's been hardware, really expensive hardware, that clips off the signal just a little bit and does it without adding a whole lot of extra distortion. And now that we're in the software era, there's a number of products that do pretty much the same thing. Let's take a look at a few of them. So let's start with the obvious question. Why would you want to do this? Why would you want to clip your signal? Clipping is bad, right? Well, there's historical precedents to start out with. Back during the height of the loudness wars, you wanted to get loudness anywhere you possibly could. And shaving off a decibel here or a decibel there off the top meant you could boost your signal even higher without it distorting. So that's what engineers did, because clipping is essentially like limiting, just with an infinitely fast attack and release. So it means you can make things louder and you don't screw up your transient impact as much. I mean, you're still chopping off the tops of your transients, but it's just a little bit here and there. So you're not squashing your signal quite the same way as a limiter would. And then when you're done, you can feed everything into an actual limiter, and the limiter doesn't have to work as hard because it's not having to catch all these peaks to do the same amount of gain reduction, and you end up with sort of a cleaner output. So that's what all these engineers would do. You take a good converter like a Lavery or a Prism Sound or an Apogee or a Burl. These are all super clean and they have a lot of headroom and they can take a lot of signal, and they're also eye-wateringly expensive. I think last I checked, a Lavery Gold still cost like $8,000. That's nothing to sneeze at for a 2-channel box that does nothing but digital to analog and analog to digital conversion. Dan Lavery is a friggin' genius, and these are beautiful, beautiful machines, which is why they're so expensive, but they're kind of out of reach for most of us. Now, okay, in the modern context, it's not super important to get those, last tiny bits of gain, because the loudness wars are less relevant. You may still need to crank some loudness if you're doing dance music for the clubs or something like that, which admittedly I am sometimes. But even still, with streaming normalization and all that stuff, it's not, it's not 100% necessary. But it still has its place, because if you want to make your limiter work less hard, and it does sort of impart its own sound to the audio, even if that sound is kind of not a sound, if that makes any sense. The sound is basically, it's not all the things you're used to hearing, like tape or limiters or tubes or whatever. It's sort of a sound that isn't a sound, and that's something a lot of us grew up listening to, because all the recordings we heard from the late 90s, early 2000s were done this way. So it kind of has a vibe in a weird way. And now we're in the software era. So instead of needing an $8,000 hardware box and a couple of cables to pull this off, you just need the right software. It's computationally not tremendously difficult to do this. I mean, it's essentially just wave shaping. All these processes that alter dynamics in some way really are limiting, compression, distortion. It's just a wave function that defines what happens to your audio at different amplitudes. So if you really wanted to do this, you could just take a wave shaper plugin, and there are a couple that let you draw your own curves and draw the appropriate curves, but not all of us know what those appropriate curves actually look like, and sometimes you just don't have the time or you don't want to spend the effort. So you get something like this that does it all for you, and you're a step ahead of the game because it's all about workflow. Now, of course, this effect is subtle. If it's done right, it's subtle. And you can drive a lot of these things pretty hard, but I'm not going to, because it sounds like crap if you do that, no matter how good the software or hardware is. I mean, if you're pumping 24 decibels of gain into a Lavery Gold, it's still going to distort. So, I mean, for the purposes of demonstration, I'm probably even going to drive these hotter than I normally would. And also, so, it will make enough of a change that the YouTube compression won't completely destroy it. But it's still going to be more than I probably would in a practical setting. I mean, I would usually never slice off more than 1 or 2 decibels off the top. And in this case, I might be chopping off 4, 5, 6 of some peaks just for the purposes of showing that this actually works. I mean, I could even go harder with a few of these, but I won't, because a few of the other ones have some limits. A pun. Have some limits to how hard you can push them anyway. Like the Newfangled Elevate will only let you push the clipper in, like, I think it's like 12 decibels. So I'm not really going more than 12 decibels on anything, which still a lot. But some of these will let you push it 20, 30 if you really feel like it, which I don't. So let's see, what are we going to look at? Some of these are only clippers. Some of these are clippers with limiters built in. Some of them are part of bigger packages. Some of them are clippers with extra things. Like, let me start with this one, Schwabe GoldClip, which is one of the newer ones. It purports to emulate a Lavery Gold converter, and it has a few interesting features, like box tone, where it emulates the sort of the high frequency roll off you get from the box that compensates for the extra harmonics you get when you're clipping. I mean, there's not an actual EQ in the Lavery Gold box, but this sort of emulates the sort of spectral stuff that happens. I guess I'm going based off what it says on the website, not necessarily what I know about Dan Lavery's deep DSP magic. It also has this gold thing, which is some sort of like infinitely fast compressor kind of thing. I think it's essentially a saturator, based off of how some of the circuits in some versions of the Lavery saturated. It's unusual, but this is a new one. This is an interesting one. So we'll take a look at that one. We've got TDR Limiter6, which is a package from Tokyo Dawn Records. It has more than just a limiter. It's got a compressor, an HF limiter, a peak limiter, and a clipper. We're going to look just at the clipper part, which gives you a couple of options for different kinds of clipping. Open is a multi-band. B-wall is a brick wall, which is a straight clipper all the way across the signal. LF clip does some biasing stuff, if I remember correctly, and you can specify the knee from hard to soft and mid-side separation and wet and dry mix, all that jazz. One thing about GoldClip, one of my favorite things, is if you want to mess with the wet and dry mix, they can be linked, which is just, I love that. I don't know why more plugins don't do that. It's like one of my least favorite things about Logic's Space Designer Reverb is that you can't adjust the wet dry mix together. You have to do them independently. Anyway, we got that one. We've got Kazrog KClip, which is one of the big names. It's got all sorts of algorithms, from smooth, which lets you change the knee a bit to soften the clipping effect, crisp, which supposedly emulates or is based on the algorithm from a Lavery Blue, if I'm not mistaken. And then it's got some others, and they range from subtle, like tube and tape, which are essentially, distortions, all the way down to broken speakers. And you can do some really wild creative stuff. Like, some of these are obviously not meant for the master bus. They're meant to be put on a synthesizer or a guitar or used as an effect. So KClip will let you do some pretty insane oversampling, like 32x oversampling. Most of these have oversampling. GoldClip has it built in, and it's always on. The others you specify. Boz Digital Big Clipper 2 just dropped a couple months ago. It's the sequel to Big Clipper 1, which it's a clipper, but it also has saturation and some other stuff built in. It's a lower cost option because none of the Boz stuff is super expensive, and it comes bundled with a little clipper, which is basically just like this part right here without any of the other stuff. So it's a lower footprint, smaller, faster, lower latency, yada, yada, yada. It doesn't have the options, but if you need to save a few cycles and you don't care about the other stuff, yeah, it's not bad. So it's, value for money. And then Newfangled Elevate, which is technically a limiter filter bank thing. It's a crazy multi-band limiter. I think you can have up to 26 different bands, and if you want to drive something loud, you can do it with this sucker. But it does have a clipper section as well. They call it a spectral clipper. I don't know exactly what that means. I assume that there's some sort of relation to the filter bank here and like how it clips. So these are all the different filters. Uses a Melharmonic scale, which is kind of cool, and if you're into that sort of thing. You can adjust the hardness of the clipper shape. This also, like I said, has a limiter and a transient enhancer and all sorts of other stuff, and a kind of weird user interface, but whatever, it still works. I'm just, for this purposes, I'm just keeping it pegged to clipper. I've turned off everything else. And there are some others that I don't necessarily have, or I'm just not going to show for the purposes of expedience. Like Acoustica Audio has just released one called Ash, which is a big emulation of a bunch of different clipper circuits. Like, it does the Lavery Blue, it does an Apogee, it does some sort of Dangerous box, I think, and it even emulates one of their other plugins called Fire the Clip. DMG Limitless, I actually do have that one. It has a little tiny clipper module down in the corner, which lets you select a couple of obscurely named clipper algorithms before you punch things into their limiter, but it's all kind of tied together. Hornet Magnus just hit version 3, and that's a combination clipper and limiter. I used to use version 2 in my live rig for my in-ear monitors, and it worked pretty well. It's also very cheap, so that's always a good one. And even the venerable Sonox Oxford Inflator is, I guess, technically a clipper. It's sort of this weird wave shaping thing, and it does some clipping, but you don't really know what's going on under the hood because it's like 2 sliders and a couple of buttons, so it's magic. And it's hard to demonstrate that. But to see kind of what's happening, I'm using Sonable Smart Limit as my final limiter to show you what's going on. So here's a techno track that I've been kind of poking at, and you can see what's happening in Smart Limit. We're getting a fair amount of gain reduction on this thing with everything else shut off. So you can see it's really clipping about, or limiting about you know, 8, 9, 10 decibels of gain reduction. So the limiter is getting a bit of a workout. Now let's kick on, let's first kick on GoldClip and see what happens to the signal. We're essentially getting the same kind of loudness, but the limiter is doing now like less than a decibel. That's a little extreme of a change, but you can see what GoldClip is doing. It's clipping off everything above this blue line, which is the threshold. So it's shearing off the top of that signal. Like I said before, I wouldn't necessarily drive it this hard in a real production scenario, but you can hear what's happening. You can also hear that it's kind of softening the high ends a little bit. That's specific to what GoldClip does with this box tone and the way they deal with their clip shapes. If you switch between their classic and modern and hard clipping, you can see that there is a difference. So there's that one. Now you can see the same kind of behavior if I switch over to TDR Limiter6. Same sort of thing. Slightly different sound. You can see it says I'm clipping 3 decibels, but I know I'm clipping more than that. I mean, obviously, it's not clipping quite the same way because you can see the gain reduction's a little higher on the limiter. But, you know, it's clipping. We can change the clipping type. Now it's a little more similar to what we had before, but it's changing the tonal balance a little bit. So there's that one. Kazrog KClip. Turn off the settings here. The clip meter seems to have clipping 7.3 decibels off so far since I turned it on. Getting the same ballpark for gain reduction, changes in gain reduction. Again, you can hear a difference in sound. If I set this to smooth, oops, and this is a bug, and sometimes it doesn't always switch back. I can change the knee, so you can actually get more sort of perceived loudness, although at the cost of a little extra distortion and a little more low end. Sometimes that can get a little muddy, but that's kind of neat. I'm using mostly the threshold command controls here on all of these, so I'm not changing the input and output levels too much. It's still coming in at a certain level and going out at roughly that same level. It's just sort of changing the shape of the signal. I could use the input and output to do sort of the same thing. Especially in this one where you can link them, so I could, you know, dial up 12 decibels here and dial out -12, and then it would be sort of unity gain. But the ultimate effect would be roughly the same. So Kazrog KClip. Let's look at Boz BigClipper. Same kind of deal. It's not clipping as much as the others. As you can see, the limiter still has to work a little harder than on any of the others. I've got the distortion. I mean, it says it's 50% on, but it's not blended in. So yeah, it's doing something, but it's not doing everything. And then finally we've got Newfangled Audio. This one's user interface is a little harder to understand. You can sort of see where it's clipping, but it's hard me. So you can see what's actually happening there. Let's bring back the limiter to see. Now this one we're actually probably getting the most clipping And I suspect that's because it's doing it in a multi-band fashion, but it's the most consistent, but it's also probably squashing our dynamics the most here too. So there's always a bit of a trade-off. What is kind of cool, some of these will let you monitor the delta, so you can hear exactly what's being, like there you can hear what's being shaved off, which is kind of wild. It's, you can hear that it's a lot, and probably more than you'd want in most scenarios, but for the purposes of demonstration. GoldClip will let you monitor that as well, although because of all this stuff going on, your delta also tends to contain a lot of the original signal. So if I mute the dry signal and do something, it's still kind of weird. So you can hear the difference between the input and output, but because of the gold and the box tone and the way the clipper works, it still sounds a lot like the original signal. The interesting thing about this one is this gold. You add this, you can get pretty different tonal balances. This is some sort of wet dry on this infinite knee compressor thing that I don't fully understand. And then you've got this alchemy. Turn it on. This is sort of like a tape saturation. So it's an extra little bit there, which is related to the clipper, but isn't quite the clipper, for whatever that means. So there you go. That's a bunch of different clippers doing their clippy things. Honestly, I'm not sure what Big Clipper is doing. I wonder if it's doing something else under the hood that I am not aware of. But regardless, there are a lot of options out there. Some of them, as you can see, are very good and fairly useful. In a mastering scenario, I might use one of these to just keep a few transients under control before I hit my limiters, so I could avoid a lot of limiter pumping. Otherwise, you know, I mean, you can hit these suckers hard if you really want loudness. I wouldn't necessarily do that myself, but your mileage may vary. So you might have gotten the idea that the differences between a lot of those plugins are very, very subtle. And you'd be right. They are very, very subtle, if they're even audible. And that's pushing it pretty hard. If you shove them into audible distortion, yeah, you can hear differences a lot more, but who's really going to do that in certainly a mixing or mastering situation? Maybe for some sort of creative purpose, you'd want to hard clip something into, you know, complete fuzzy distortion craziness, but day to day, you probably wouldn't want to do that much. So the upshot is a lot of them are pretty similar, and it kind of comes down to workflow and other features you may get. In fact, since I tested a lot of these, I even grabbed a few more. I tried Acoustica Ash, which is another highly rated one, and it's very good. The insane 1024 time oversampling is just baffling and sounds great. Gets rid of pretty much anything in the way of aliasing noise, but again, you don't really get much if you're pushing it to reasonable levels. So, you know, if you're clipping off a peak here, a peak there, you're not gonna hear much distortion. You're not gonna get too much in the way of aliasing. You're not gonna get any artifacting. So kind of what it comes down to is what works for you and what is your preference in terms of workflow. I've been liking GoldClip a lot, mostly because the metering is great, and it tells you where your peaks are. I've been using Kazrog KClip 3 for years because it's very similar in that regard. It shows you exactly what's going on in your signal. But, you know, the others are good too. They just might not have features that I personally like, but your mileage may vary. TDR Limiter6 is great because it has stuff above and beyond your standard clipper or standard limiter. It's got all sorts of other stuff and is kind of a toolbox, which is why I ended up getting it. The clipper was incidental for me with that purchase. I wanted the compressor and the HF limiter and all that sort of thing. So what it comes down to is what works for you, because when you're clipping, particularly when you're doing very specific kinds of hard clipping, unless you're doing something really radical or going for some sort of incredibly ear-bleeding loudness, you're not going to find too much in the way of difference. Maybe if you have some sort of super golden bat ears type hearing, which I do not, being, deep into middle age, a little high frequency hearing loss has, affected me above 17 kilohertz. So maybe if there's something going on around 2,000 or 20,000 hertz, I'm not going to hear it. And some whippersnapper, hippity hop artist with the bipping and the bopping out there is going to be like, hey, I hear some distortion there. Well, okay, maybe then, but for the most part, not going to be an issue. So take it all with a grain of salt.